Yeah, I thought you said sure. Okay. Welcome to My Bible app. I had to do some big turn. Welcome to My Bible app. Be fancy with it. We're so glad everyone's here today. We're in our hot topics for this season of 2017. And at this point, you guys have so many hot topics this year, I'm just running with it, and we're just going to keep going until you guys stop giving them to me. But they keep coming in. So if you have more at this time, it's not too late. You're welcome to hand them in to me. We have slips somewhere. My wife does, I think. But you can also, we'll have them on the table over there so you can grab them on your way out if you want to. Or send them to me through the email at mybibleapp, nrcc@gmail.com. And we'll get them to me that way. That works as well. They are anonymous if you want them to be. You don't have to attach your name. Although, I sometimes have questions I want to make sure I understand and I get your question answered or your hot topic to you the way you're thinking about it. So if you don't mind putting your name on it, sometimes that helps me a little bit. But I'll leave that up to you. Okay, today our hot topic is about the abomination of desolation. How many of you have heard of the abomination of desolation? How many of you have not heard of the abomination of desolation? Okay, so of those of you who have not heard about the abomination of desolation, give me some ideas about what you think it is. What does it sound like? Just the ones who have not heard. No, Congress does not count as an answer. They're one or the other. They're either an abomination or they've desolated the place and they're gone. That's one or the other. And abomination and desolation. An O there? Yeah, abomination. I know. I've seen those bumper stickers too. Yeah. Okay, all right. You guys settle down or I'm going to have to put the hoses on you. No, so back to my question. What does abomination of desolation sound like to you? Those of you who have not heard of it. What comes to your mind when you think of it? Mankind? Oh, end times? Okay. Kirk? A group that's destroying something. Okay? Good thoughts? Any other ideas or thoughts about what it might be? Hell? Okay. That's good. Good thought. Any others? Those of you who have heard of abomination of desolation, what do you think it is about? Something really bad that destroys. Okay? That's pretty rational. Common sense? I think that's very logical. Thank you, Captain. Very logical. Any other ideas? Susan? The point when Antichrist declares himself God? Okay. I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my eye teeth. I can't see what I'm saying. Next, anybody else? Boy, it's a tough crowd. Nothing. I've got a great show for you. Nothing. Okay. No respect. Nothing else? That's it? Okay, so I'm going to make a declaration here that this class basically knows very little, if anything, about the abomination of desolation. Okay, so crack open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24. Let's see if we can figure some of this out. I'm going to tell you today what I think it's about and the reason why I think that. As always, you are not allowed to disagree with me, but you are also not allowed to agree with me. I just want you to study, okay? I want you to determine what you think or believe this means. But I think I have a pretty good answer, so I'm anxious to see what you guys think about it. Verse 1 in chapter 24, Jesus left the temple and was going away. His disciples came and called his attention to its buildings. But Jesus answered, "You see all of these? Yes, I tell you, they will be totally destroyed. Not a single stone will be left standing." Verse 3, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will these things happen? What will be the sign that you are coming and that the end times, or that the generation is ending?" And Jesus replied, "Watch out. Don't let anyone fool you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah. They will lead many astray. You will hear the noise of wars nearby, the news of wars far off. See to it that you don't become frightened. Such things must happen, but the end is yet to come. For people will fight against each other, nations will fight each other, and there will be famines, earthquakes in various parts of the world. All of this is but the beginning of the birth pains. At that time you'll be arrested, handed over to be punished, and put to death, and all people will hate you because of me. At that time many will be trapped into betraying and hating each other. Many false prophets will appear and fool many people, and many people's love will grow cold because of increased distance from the law. But whoever holds out till the end will be delivered, and this is the good news about the kingdom. It will be announced throughout the world as a witness to the Gentiles. It is then that the end will come. Verse 15. So when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken about through the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand the allusion. That's how mine reads. That will be the time for those in Judea to escape to the hills. If someone is on the roof, he must not go down to gather his belongings from his house. If someone is in the field, he must not turn back to get his coat. What a terrible time it will be for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that you will have to escape in winter, that you will not have to escape in winter or on the Sabbath, for there will be trouble then worse than there's ever been from the beginning of the world until now, and there will be nothing like it again. That's a big statement right there. Indeed, if the length of this time had not been limited, no one would survive, but for the sake of those who have been chosen, its length will be limited. At that time, if someone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe him. For there will appear false messiahs and false prophets performing miracles, amazing things, so as to fool even the chosen if possible. There, I've told you in advance. So if people say to you, listen, he's out in the desert, don't go. Or look, he's in the way in a secret room, don't believe it. For when the Son of Man does come, it will be like lightning that flashes out of the east and fills the sky to the western horizon. Wherever there's a dead body, that's where you find the vultures. Okay, so we're going to stop there. All right, so the question that comes about this hot topic reads this way, and let me give you your handouts that will help you follow along. I think you need a couple more. Here you go, sir. Can you pass those for me? Thank you. The question came to me this way: what is the abomination? Wow, this side of the room's got a lot going on. The question is, what is the abomination of desolation described by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, what we just read? My answer to that question, as always, is pretty lengthy, but I give some summary this way. First, we must state that what Jesus said correctly, because the question that's asked implies the desolation was the abomination. So in other words, the question came to me, what is the abomination of desolation? Jesus didn't say this. That's the first problem with this. If we're going to figure out what it is, then we've got to put it in the proper statement, in the proper context. And this is neither. Abomination of desolation makes it sound like the desolation itself was the abomination. And that's not what it is. What Jesus actually said was abomination that causes desolation. So the abomination is one thing, the desolation is another thing. And the desolation is the result of the abomination. So we're going to find out what each of those are. So now we re-ask the question, which would be, what abomination was Jesus referring to that caused or would cause desolation? That's the actual question. That's where we're headed. So I believe that what Jesus was referring to was the destruction of the temple, which is the abomination portion of this, on Av 9 through 11, 70 CE, or AD, for those of you who prefer. What am I talking about? Okay. Yeah, we're gonna learn a lot about this today. You guys are gonna get a big history lesson today, okay? In 70 CE, Titus was sent in by Caesar, his father. I always mispronounce his name. Vespasian. Thank you. I was going to say Vesparian. It's not right. Vespasian had a son named Titus. He sent his son Titus into Jerusalem, and there was a war. But actually, Vespasian was the one who began this conflict, which started months earlier, somewhere back in March. I use the word Av here because that is the Jewish name of the month that this event occurred in. But the month, as we'll see in a moment, is really, it's like a combination of our July and August. Okay? It starts in July, it ends in August. Because of the Jewish calendar being a lunar calendar versus a solar calendar that we use. Does that make sense? So, for your context, here we go. Av. A-V. Right there. A-V. Av. 9 through 11. So, here's the way it works. Back in March of that year, 70 CE. What's the question? No. A-V. Av. Okay, here. Here. Shh. Listen. Av. Right there. That's the equivalent of our July/August. This is the Jewish month Av. Okay? The year that this event happened was 70. We now say CE, but some people prefer AD. Whatever you want, I don't care. I don't argue about that stuff. Christian era. The AD was the old Latin, well, it's still Latin, it's not old. Anno Domingo. I'm sorry. Say it again. Anno Domini. Thank you. I said it incorrectly. Christian era is now, no? Huh? Common era. What did I say? Christian era? Sorry. Common era. So I was always taught this meant after death. You guys ever heard that? AD means after death. Okay. No. It's Latin. Anyway, I just pointed out because everybody makes a big deal out of it whenever I say it, and I don't really want to spend any time on that. So I've already spent too much time on it. It doesn't matter. So here's what matters. March of 70. March of 70. There's uprisings in Jerusalem. What do these uprisings due to? Because the Jewish people had Gentile people in Jerusalem that didn't like Jews for whatever their reasons. And they would hurt Jews, attack Jews, they would steal from their shops, they would do things like this. And the Jewish people were tired of it because the Romans weren't doing anything to stop that. We're Roman citizens. And yet we continue to be ostracized and outcast and treated poorly like second-class citizens. And we're citizens like anybody else. We have the same rights as all the other Romans, and you guys aren't doing anything about it. And so they started beating on the governor, and the governor wasn't doing anything about it to their satisfaction, and so they began to fight back. So if somebody punched them, they punched somebody back. If somebody stole from them, they captured, kind of kidnapped them maybe and beat them up and whatever. But they began to fight back, and this started skirmishes within the city. The Gentiles and the Jews were fighting with each other. There was also building going on, and they were building and closing the gaps in the passageways to get to the temple until pretty soon it was so narrow, couldn't hardly get very many people in there. So they were obstructing their way to the temple. And this was all being done based on, hey, this is my property, I can build wherever I want to. You Jewish people can't tell me where to build. So slowly but surely, these skirmishes began to happen more and more. And so Caesar, at the time, he sent some people in there to take care of it, and wasn't really getting anywhere with it. And he was also going, I'm not that concerned about it. You governors in that area, in that region, need to squelch that, quash those problems, and get it taken care of. And at that time, that's really what was done. We read about the time that Jesus was taken before Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate, remember the ceremonial washing of the hands? It's very famous that he did. You know what that was all about? Was the same kind of problem. He was afraid. He'd already been warned by Caesar, if you don't get control of your area, you keep allowing all these problems to happen, these fights and these little battles and wars to go on, you're out, buddy, you're out. And he'd already warned Pontius Pilate several times before. So Pilate was like, what do I do if I don't crucify Jesus? The Jews are going to be upset. If I do crucify Jesus, The whole thing could start a war. Finally, he just washed his hands. You guys asked me. That's why he brought out Barabbas. Who do you want me to give to you? Every year I release somebody. Who do you want? Barabbas, Barabbas. And so off Barabbas goes. That way, he could say, I gave the people what they wanted. Well, the same kind of issue was going on here. And the governor at this time, in 70, was not getting the job done, but it wasn't so bad that Caesar was really upset about it. But Caesar finally goes, you know what? We're going to send somebody in there to take care of this. And he grabbed this general of his, Vespasian, who he was an okay general. He wasn't very popular or very famous or anything like that. And Caesar sent him in there. And Vespasian began to do things. No, it was Vespasian initially. Vespasian became emperor. Nero was emperor at the time. Nero dies. And a lot of people tried to become emperor, and it didn't work. They went through like 2 or 3 within a real short period of time. And Vespasian finally won that deal and became emperor. And he's already gone into Jerusalem, and kind of in March, or the earlier part of the year, he's already gone in and he's getting things under control, but the Jewish people are still fighting hard. So when he becomes emperor, he sends his son Titus behind him. Titus goes in. Now this is later in the year. Now we're getting closer to Av. What's happening now is that Titus is saying, look, I don't want to destroy you guys and your temple and your people and all that kind of stuff, but if you don't stop this fighting, that's what's happening. So we're going to take a strategy first where I'm going to cut off all supplies around the city. And so things began to dwindle, and they just sort of waited it out. And people began to run out of food and run out of water and run out of things like that, and they hoped to starve them out, and that would solve the problem. It made it worse. And as things continue to escalate, Titus finally goes in, and by the time this whole thing is over, the entire city has been decimated. Okay? It's a bad deal. So let's read this paragraph and move in and see what Jesus, how does this connect with what Jesus said. We'll compare 6 prophetic descriptions of the desolation caused by the abomination, or the destruction of the temple, to the descriptions of historian Flavius Josephus, who had a front row seat to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and determine if these accounts match. In addition, we'll look at the same prophecy from Daniel, which Jesus mentions, to see how his prophecy stacks up to the same event. Remember, we just got through reading. Jesus said, hey, remember what Daniel said? So Daniel's got some part in this deal. Well, Daniel was hundreds of years before Jesus made the statement, and before this situation happened. All right, so let's take a look at the first prophecy. Jesus was very specific. In the second verse in the chapter, Jesus gives a specific structural location. First blank there is structural. Okay? It reads this way. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to the buildings. Do you see these things? He asked. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everything will be thrown down. Okay, that's the first prediction that Jesus gives. So, about the abomination that causes desolation. Is Jesus talking about this event in 70 CE? I think so. Here's why. In the statement, Jesus sets up what he is about to tell the disciples by referencing the temple around them, predicting its destruction. There's only 2 times in history that Solomon's temple was attacked and destroyed. And the first time, it already happened hundreds of years before, during the Babylonian attack and the ultimate exile of Israel. The second time happened at this event that we're talking about. Okay? So which temple destruction was Jesus referring to? You've got 2 options to choose from. Was Jesus talking about the destruction back in 586 BC under Nebuchadnezzar when he brought all of Judea into exile? Why is he not talking about that one? Because it already happened. Jesus said these are things that are going to happen, not things that have already happened, right? So, guys, that's pretty simple to me. You've got 2 choices. One of them already happened. The only other destruction of the temple he could be talking about had to be this, because as we sit here now in 2017, there's been no third temple that was built and then destroyed. So it could only be that one that he's referring to. You say, well, Yeah, but Dwayne, what about somewhere in the future from here? Maybe Jesus is thinking about 2,000 years from where we are today. Maybe there will be a third temple, and that will be destroyed, and that's what Jesus is talking about. I don't think so, and I'll explain why here in a little bit. Here's an important note. Josephus describes weapons the Romans used against the Jews during this war as machines. If you read through Josephus, which I recommend you do, by the way, it's a fascinating read. But he talks about these machines that the Romans used. What he's referring to are catapult-type devices that hurled huge boulders at fortified walls. You guys, can you get that picture? Seen that in movies and stuff? They threw big slingshots. You know, they would tie this thing down. They would get these big boulders in there. They'd cut the rope and boom, right? Off this boulder would go. These things were capable of destroying, because you've got to ask yourself, I asked myself, how is it with sword and shield and basic manpower were men able to get into the city and destroy the temple where no stone was sitting on top of these? No human could do that. Are you kidding me? That temple was a fortified temple. But Josephus describes these machines. They would just pummel, just beat on. And we know now that the west wall is the only thing that was left. Every stone was unturned, just like Jesus had described. Okay? So that's the first prophecy that Jesus gives. Now, the next prophecy doesn't happen until verse 15. Well, what about all the stuff in between verse 2 and verse 15, Dwayne? Jesus talks about all those things as well. Yeah, but you'll notice if you go back and look at it, Jesus begins talking, he starts off saying, this temple right here is going to be destroyed. That's a very specific, zeroed-in kind of a comment for him to make. And then starting in verse 3 all the way through verse 14, he now kind of backs up into a bigger picture, and he says, watch out what's going to happen in the world around you. You're going to hear about wars, rumors of wars, nations fighting against one another all over the place. You're going to hear about world events, earthquakes, famines, things are going to happen all over the globe. He's talking in the big picture sense. And then when he gets to verse 15, he narrows things back down, and he mentions specifically abomination that causes desolation. And in that sentence, he references Daniel. So now we got to look at Daniel. What's Daniel got to do with it? Great question. So prophecy number 2. Jesus ties it to Daniel's prophecy. Time does not permit for us to get into Daniel's prophecy today, so I'm going to summarize this for you a little bit. If you'll look at first of all, here's what Jesus says in verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, again, standing in the holy place, he gives us a specific location where this abomination takes place, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Okay, so let's go back to Daniel. Jesus is referring to what we call Daniel chapter 29. Chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. And this is where Jesus gets the phrase, abomination that causes desolation. If you read those 3 verses in Daniel, you'll see that same phrase used. Okay? Now, the prophecy of Daniel is very detailed. It requires a lot of math, which will take more time than we have today. So, the summary is that the angel of Gabriel appears to Daniel and interprets a dream that Daniel had. And he tells Daniel, here's what the dream means, that the Israelites are going to be in captivity for 70 years. After that, the temple is going to be rebuilt, which of course happens by the decree of King Artaxerxes of Persia with Nehemiah at the lead. You guys know that story? After the exile's over, Nehemiah he's the wine bearer, the cupbearer of King Artaxerxes of Persia, and he says, hey, I'd like to go back and begin to rebuild my city. And Artaxerxes says, go ahead and do that. So Nehemiah goes and he gathers up people, and they go and they begin to rebuild Jerusalem. That happened in 445 BC. All right, now following the restoration of the temple, Gabriel then explains to Daniel, the Messiah will present himself to Israel. It's the only time in the Old Testament the word Messiah, or anointed one, is actually used. Interesting word. The Messiah will present himself to Israel. He will be rejected, and he'll have nothing. That's a reference to the cross. He's going to show up. He's going to tell who he is. He's going to reveal himself to the world. and then he's going to be rejected, shut down, and crucified. Following this, the temple will be destroyed once again. And this destruction is described as the abomination that causes desolation. When Gabriel tells Daniel the second time the temple is going to be destroyed, Gabriel's the one that uses the phrase. It will be an abomination that causes desolation. So what makes Daniel's account so compelling is the fact that he's talking about the year 70, that war. It's the timeline that he provides from Nehemiah, which happened in 445 BC, to Titus in 70 CE. I say it's astonishing. It is astonishing. I don't have time to do the math for you, but when you sit down and you calculate the math, and you have to do it based on a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. You have to do it based on calculation of days, not years. But you can't get to the days calculation until you do the years calculation. It's deep and it's difficult to get through, okay? I'm not going to do it today, but here's the sum of it. Here's the sum of it. The sum of it is, Gabriel says, look, from the time that Nehemiah begins to build Jerusalem back from the Babylonian destruction in 445 BC, to the time that the temple is destroyed the second time, it's going to be X amount of days. The abomination of desolation is going to be X amount of days. And those calculations play out exactly in history. It's phenomenal. It is to the letter. And the interesting thing is, the final destruction of the temple in 70 CE is on the same day, in the same month, as the first destruction of the temple under Nebuchadnezzar. It is exactly to the day. Amazing. Right? I don't think those are coincidences, guys. I don't believe in that. Okay? So here's the sum. Daniel's prophecy that Jesus references gives us an exact timeline for the abomination of desolation. And it takes us from the building, again, of Jerusalem, from Nehemiah, 445 BC, to Av 11, 9 through 11, 70 CE. Okay? Any questions on that? All right, that's prophecy number 2. Prophecy number 3. Jesus gives a very specific geographic location. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 16. Jesus says, let those who are in where? Judea. So in verse 15, he says the abomination of desolation, that causes desolation, rather. And then in the very next verse, he says, in Judea. Now in verse 2, he tells you it's the temple that's going to be destroyed. The abomination of desolation, as we just said, the timeline puts us into that period, on that day, on that month. And now Jesus says, in Judea, specifically. So now we have a very geographic location. Now the reason I'm going through this painstakingly this way is because a lot of people believe that Matthew chapter 24 has to do with what Judy said, the end times. But here's the problem that I have with the phrase end times. Somebody describe that to me. Christians run around all the time going, oh, the end times, the end times, the end times. What are you talking about, the end times? What does that mean, the end times? Well, but the world is not ended yet. It's still here. This isn't the end of the world. But that's what people think. So you're right, Judy. That's what people think. We associate it with what Susan said, the so-called Antichrist that comes to power. You know the Bible doesn't describe an Antichrist that comes to power. Not there. What are you talking about, Dwayne? What about Revelation? Where the 3 years, the 7 years is 3 years apiece. I know. That's there. I'm not arguing that, but the Bible doesn't say he's the Antichrist. He's referred to as the beast. Why is that important? Because Antichrists are non-believers. That's everybody. If you do not possess the Holy Spirit, you are Antichrist. It just means that you don't believe. That's all it means. It doesn't mean you're some horrible, evil person that's going to rise to power and destroy the world. That's not what it means. I don't know why Christians have created this character in history. Labeled him the Antichrist. You lose the point that Paul was talking about when he talked about the man of perdition and so on. And we tie all that together. We try to make this big history. Look, guys, end times began when? Oof, that's messy. We don't know. 33 AD. Pentecost, yes. The death of Christ. Of course, the resurrection. And then the following 40 days. This whole period right here is the beginning of the end times. Christ dies, then he's raised, then he spends 40 days here, then he ascends to earth, and then the Holy Spirit is ushered in. That's the beginning of the end. Now, how long are the end times going to last? I don't know. I have no clue. So far, it's been just right around 2,000 years. Okay? Will it be another 2,000 years? Possibly. 4,000? 5,000? 10,000? Possibly. I don't know. I have no clue. Jesus himself doesn't even know, because the end of the end times is his return. And Jesus himself says, I don't even know when that is. My Father's the only one who knows that. So I'm not going to sit here and try to predict end times. What I'm telling you is we are in the end times now, and have been since Christ died. Does that make sense? Okay. So could someone say, hey, what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24 is end times prophecy? Would that be an accurate statement? Of course it would, because it happened after the death of Christ, did it not? Therefore, it's an end times prophecy. Does it have to do with the man who comes to power that Revelation describes, that wins the world over with peace for several years and then turns on them and resurrects a statue at the Temple Mount and says, bow down and worship this image of me that's described in Revelation? Is that the abomination of desolation? Well, let me ask you this. Is that an end-time prophecy? Yes, it is. But is it the abomination of desolation? Some believe so. I don't believe so. The reason I don't believe so is because of this geographic location that Jesus gave us, and I misspelled. Big shocker. Let's look at what I read here, or what I wrote here after the verse. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This is a very specific region Jesus refers to. In the verses that precede this one, he references world events such as countries at war with each other, catastrophic natural events. However, suddenly Jesus becomes very specific to the region of Judea when he uses the phrase abomination that causes desolation. Jesus also advises those in that region to flee to the surrounding areas outside the city. As I was doing research on this, I found there's a lot of people that attempt to put this piece, who flew to the mountains? Who was fleeing to the mountains? Who were those groups of people? Did people flee to the mountains in Av of 70 AD? Well, we don't really know for sure. Some say yes, others say maybe. I looked for it through Josephus. I couldn't find that Josephus specifically referred to. They started fleeing. Now, Eusebius, who I think, let's read this next part. Josephus claims that 1.1 million people were killed during the war with the Romans in Jerusalem. The majority of those dead were Jewish, with another 97,000 taken into slavery. Those are big numbers. Of the rest that remained, it is said that they fled to surrounding areas of Jerusalem, and the Christian historian Eusebius claims that several Christian groups got out of Jerusalem at the time the uprisings first began, back in February, March, that area. But it's difficult to prove, because it doesn't really there's not enough in the writings that specifically say who and where and how many and where they go exactly. Some think it was this town, some say others. We don't really know. We know for sure that Jews did not again inhabit Jerusalem until 1948, when they were able to claim it as their home. So my theory on this is that some Jews made it out. 1.1 million were killed, or the majority of that group were Jewish people, and they were killed. Another 97,000 went into slavery. Well, there were others that died in the months previous to this because of the famine. As we'll read in a moment, Josephus describes the scene as bodies stacked on bodies in the streets of Jerusalem. You couldn't even walk down a pathway without stepping on or over bodies, dead bodies. That's how many dead were. Now, how many of that was part of the 1.1 versus how many were killed, died versus because of the famine versus being killed by the sword? I don't know. Josephus doesn't really break that out. He lumps these numbers together, but there's still huge numbers. I have no doubt that some Jewish people made it out at some point. But you've got to realize this, too. When Titus comes in, by the time Titus comes in, he seals off every area of the city. There was no getting out. That's why they starved to death inside the city, because Titus locked down every area of access, okay? Including tunnels. There were tunnels under the temple. Everything was shut down, okay? So if anybody got out, they got out earlier. But here's the thing that I like to point out. Jesus did not instruct people to flee to the mountains. He advised it. There's a difference. Look at the way it reads. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. My advice is get out and get out quick. It's going to be bad. Joan. Good question. There were Gentiles that died in this as well. Yeah. But the overwhelming majority of it was Jewish people. This was an attack on the Jews. Okay? This was seen as the Jews are causing problems in Judea. Go get them. The Jews' argument was, hey, we didn't start this thing. These Greeks are coming in here and they're pilfering and stealing and looting and they're killing and they're doing all this stuff. We are protecting ourselves and defending ourselves. But that's not how Rome saw it. Okay? You're always going to have some kind of, there was really no real good historical information other than Josephus, by the way. But I think that Josephus was pretty objective overall. He talked about the weaknesses of Titus and his failures as much as he talked about his successes. So, anyway, there's arguments on that. We can maybe do that another time. Let's look at the fourth prophecy. The fourth prophecy is that certain groups' suffrage Is that not a word? Sorry. Suffering will be greater than others. I never was that smart. Certain groups' suffering will be greater than others. Verse 19, Jesus says, how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. He doesn't say that about any other group. Guys, from what I read, from what Josephus writes about this whole thing, it was bad for everybody. But why does Jesus single this out? Well, here's the story that Josephus told. Among the residents of the region beyond Jordan was a young woman called Mary, daughter of Eleazar, of the village of Bethesda. Most of the property she had packed up and brought with her from Perea had been plundered by the tyrants. She grew weary of trying to find food for her kinsfolk. Famine gnawed at her vitals, and the fire of rage was fiercer than famine. Seizing her child, an infant at the breast, she cried, my poor baby, why should I keep you alive in this world of war and famine? Even if we live till the Romans come, they will make us slaves. And anyway, hunger will get us before the slavery does. And the rebels are crueler than both. Come, be food for me. With these words, she killed her son, roasted the body, swallowed half of it, and stored the rest in a safe place. Which, by the way, if you continue reading that story, people, robbers and tyrants that she refers to, these people were going through the city, house to house, kicking in doors, breaking in, and searching for any morsel of food there could be. They found her and her child she had stored. They were so desperate to eat. But when she presented her roasted baby to them for food to spare her life, they vomited and threw up and left. They couldn't hack the idea that she was eating her own child. Guys, how horrific does the situation have to be that you will get to that point? And guess what? That's not the only story. That's just one story. Many, many mothers did this. I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus specifically says how dreadful it will be for those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. He knew what was going to happen. He knew. What a horrific thing. Prophecy number 5. Atrocity that had not been experienced before or since. For then there will be great distress, Jesus says in verse 21, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Never to be equaled again. Right now, as you sit here in this room, putting aside the story you're hearing, what is the greatest atrocity that you know of in history? Wow, there's several things. One at a time. The Holocaust. How many of you raise your hand if that was the first thing you thought of? Holocaust. Most of the room. Yeah. One says Jesus' death was the most horrific thing. That was pretty horrific. Pretty horrific. However, I think it could be argued that despite the spiritual, significance of the death of Christ, of course, that was an event on earth that happened to one person. So most people would look at atrocity as something that was multiplied, horrors multiplied. And that's why people go to the Holocaust. Can I tell you that Jesus said that no atrocity would be greater than this event right here, this abomination of desolation. Well, let's look at the numbers. Josephus says that 1.1 million Jews were killed in that skirmish, that war, not a skirmish, that war. 97,000 were taken into slavery. I don't know how many of those numbers are included in his knowledge of who died because of the famine versus who died at the sword. He didn't break that out. I guess it's possible that more died. We're going to find out that another large number of people died in a few minutes and something else associated with this. That puts the numbers at over 2 million. How many million do we say died in the Holocaust? Over 6 million, right? Well, isn't that a bigger atrocity? Isn't that a greater thing? The numbers were bigger. I don't think so. Say again? It's true. It happened over many years when this happened within a 3 or 4 month period. Yeah. But is the atrocity worse because it's shorter? Maybe the atrocity is worse because it drug out longer. How do we determine that? What was your thought, Richard? Yeah. That's a great point. So from a percentage standpoint, population-wise, greater numbers died in this war than in World War II with the Jewish people. But when we also got to keep in mind how many American soldiers died in that war fighting that, plus how many Russians died. The Russians really made a big sacrifice in that war. So, yeah, 20 million. I mean, that's just, those numbers are staggering, Dave. Yes. Russia, China, Cambodia. Right. So how can Jesus say that this particular situation, this abomination that causes desolation, is a distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now and will never be equaled again? Say again? Okay, but still the Holocaust is that same group that he was pertaining to, and it's a greater number, just in numbers. Okay, so back to the percentages again, okay? Could very well be. Yes, Joan? You think it's the time frame because it was shorter? Okay. Yeah, so for something to happen within a few months that devastating, yeah, it's difficult to recover from. Ben? Okay. Yeah. Right. I agree with that. There's no end. There's no way out. There's no, yeah. Those, okay. Guys, I think that all of those factors play into this. I don't think that any one thing separates it from any other event. Everything you just said, I think, factors into this. I don't know that, I look at what we just read about that mother and her child, and you think about how the human psyche could be broken so drastically and dramatically. I can't think of an atrocity that kind of thing has happened to. I mean, I'm certainly not going to take anything away from the Holocaust. That was horrific, and that was a huge atrocity, and there was no excuses for that. But I've got to tell you this. I think that if you step into the gas chamber, you're out quick, and you're done. There's no suffering in that. It's horrible. It's a horrible atrocity to do to somebody, but in terms of the suffering and the pain, it's quick and done. You go to sleep and you're done. what did these guys do? These guys starved to death for months and months and months. The bloodletting and the killing. We're going to read in a few moments about what. Look, just Rich, I'll get back to you in just a second. Let's look at this paragraph. I'll give you a great example. Here's what Josephus writes about this atrocity. Whereas the war with which the Jews made with the Romans had been the greatest of all of those, not only that have been in our times, but in a manner of those that were ever heard of. Josephus says, we've never heard of anything this horrible in our life. Of all the things that have happened in our history, this is hands down the worst. Both of those wherein the cities have fought against chiefs or nations against nations. He then writes, but why dwell on the commonplace rubbish? And this is in another area he wrote. Why dwell on the commonplace rubbish which the starving were driven to feed upon, given that what I have to recount is an act unparalleled in history, either of the Greeks or the barbarians. And as horrible to relate as it is incredible to hear. Josephus says, it's not even believable. You probably won't even believe me writing about this. That's how outrageous of an atrocity that this thing is. The Greeks weren't guilty of it at that point. The barbarians weren't guilty of it at that point. They were guilty of a lot of atrocities. In another place he writes, and truly the very view itself of the country was a melancholy thing. For those places which were before adorned with trees and pleasant gardens were now become a desolate country. Every way. In other words, in every direction you looked, all you saw was destruction, as far as the eye could see. Nor could any foreigner, all of its trees were cut down. Nor could any foreigner that had formerly seen Judea and the most beautiful suburbs of the city, and now see it as a desert, do anything but lament and mourn sadly as so great a change. It was unrecognizable. We're not just talking about desolation of human beings. We're not just talking about desolation of buildings and structures. We are talking about the desolation of landscapes as far as the eye could see. Nothing had come close to this. In addition to this description of the landscape, Josephus describes a horrific scene of dead bodies piled on top of each other, blocking the roadways and pathways of the city. Old bodies lying dead with infants and children. Bodies had been stripped of their clothing and lay naked in the streets. The blood that ran the streets seemed endless. The starvation was so intense, in addition to the cannibalism, it drove people to turn on each other. Look what Josephus writes. Throughout the city, people were dying of hunger in large numbers and enduring unspeakable sufferings. In every house, the merest hint of food sparked violence, and close relatives fell to blows, snatching from one another the pitiful supports of life. No respect was paid even to the dying. I don't know of stories like that in the Holocaust. I don't know of stories like that in any other time in history in those different atrocities when the people had turned on each other and didn't even respect the dying. Let me come back to you, Joan. Richard, what was your thought? Yeah. Eating placentas to stay alive. Who does this stuff? This is horrible. Joan. Well, they were living outside the city in military camps. Yeah, Rome had a lot of money and lots of supplies, and yeah, they were just waiting it out. Oh, this is a sizable area. Yeah, but it wasn't just the walls, it was the suburbs as well. It was a pretty good city, pretty good sized area. I mean, you figure we were already up to 2 million people in this city. That's a pretty good sized city. Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were just Roman soldiers just sitting in their military camps waiting. Sure. All right. Gaping with hunger, like mad dogs, lawless gangs went staggering and reeling through the streets. Need drove the starving to gnawing at anything. In the end, they were eating belts and shoes and the leather stripped off their shields. Guys, that is desperation at its worst. Well, they were trapped. They couldn't get out. You'd think, but, I don't know. The will to live. Yeah, that's a tough death. Okay, Prophecy number 6. Prophecy number 6. False prophets taking advantage of the situation. Oh, there's always a con man in the group, right? Verses 23 and 24, Jesus says, "At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Messiah,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect." Which gives you an idea that there were believers in the city. You know. Okay, here's what Josephus writes. "And now these impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness and pretend that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God. And many that were prevailed on them suffered the punishments of their folly. For Felix, who was the governor, brought them back and then punished them." So it just gives you an idea that these false prophets were in that area. This was coming. Something bad's getting ready to happen. Rome's in here. They're going to come. The destruction's coming. We can see this stuff is happening. So the David Koresh of his day rears up and says, "Come on, follow me into the wilderness. I am the Messiah. I'm here to rescue you from this coming abomination." But here's the more specific one to this particular prophecy. Josephus writes, "The slaughter was continued while the fire raged. Soon no part was left but a small portion of the outer cloisters," talking about the temple, "where 6,000 people had taken refuge, led by a false prophet who had there promised that God would deliver his people in the temple. The soldiers set the building on fire, and all perished." 6,000 people died in the temple because a false prophet said, "I'm here to deliver you." Temple was huge. Yeah. But you got to remember, too, there were outer buildings and all that. There were tunnels underneath. This was a big place. Okay. Judy? Felix was the governor at that time, in charge of that area, much like Pontius Pilate was in the other story that we read about Jesus. Any questions? What do you guys think about this? Do you think this matches up? All I wanted to do is I wanted to give you, here's front row seats about what happened in 70 AD. Here's what Jesus said. Do you think it matches? How many of you say, "Yeah, that sounds to me like it matches pretty accurately"? Okay, Tracy, and then... We don't. Josephus was he was the historian of the day. There really was no other historians. People didn't write anything down. His credibility comes from the way he writes. The prevailing theory or thought is this in historical events. If somebody is writing in such a way that it promotes themselves, their group, as a leader and so on and so forth, you might want to take it with a grain of salt, because it puts them putting themselves in this great light. But if the writer is writing and showing positive and negative, they're showing the failures as well as the successes, that kind of writing, it's a lot more credible, because people tend to make things sound a lot better than they really are. They exaggerate. They don't want to see the bad side. We only want to make it look good. Some people criticize that Josephus he was Titus' writer. I mean, he was Titus' right-hand guy. Titus said, document everything that's going on. So some argue that he made Titus look really great, because he writes that Titus didn't want to destroy the temple. He did everything he could to prevent destroying the temple. His attitude was, "Look, you're God. I don't want to fight your God. You guys need to chill out, and I'm going to go away. I don't want to do this battle, but you are forcing my hand." Some would say, well, that makes Titus look like a great guy. But he probably wasn't that great of a guy, and he went in and decimated the city. But the problem with that argument is that Josephus also writes that, Titus didn't do everything right. Titus made some boneheaded mistakes along the way, and here's what he almost got himself killed a couple of times, right? I mean, so when you're writing in that kind of voice, it lends credibility to the writer, because he's just saying, look, I'm writing what I observed, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Does that make sense? So it's a really excellent question, though. But it really is the only thing that we have that ties us to this history. We have no other documents or records of it. Oh, Janet left. Okay, Mary? Yep. He was actually a freed slave. He had been a slave to the Romans at one point and was freed, but he stayed and worked with Vespasian and Titus, and yeah, he worked for those guys. He sure did. Okay, Eusebius comes to us later in the 2nd century. He's a Christian historian. If I remember correctly, he was a bishop also, but he's our next biggest historian as it relates to, but it comes 100 or so years later, yeah. 300 years later, was it that far? Okay. Yeah, so he kept very good documents, and what Eusebius also did is that he collected stories and wrote all that down. And he wrote about this as well, based on Josephus, but also based on some other information that he had access to. Of course, that would have been word of mouth. There wasn't anything written. That's why I qualify with what Eusebius wrote. He wrote it. Maybe it's true. There's not really any way to fact check that. So, and they don't really know for sure what cities people fled to, if they fled. So we just kind of take it with a grain of salt. Exactly. That's precisely correct. Okay, so that's the abomination of desolation. Some people fear this because they don't know what it means, and they're afraid. It sounds really scary, and they're afraid they're going to be part of it. I don't think that we're going to be part of it. This happened, 1,500 years ago or whatever it is. My math's bad, but it's been a long time. That's over.